Welcome to another episode of Seven Book Club. It's almost a year that we are doing this, and in a way, not much has changed since the outbreak of pandemic. Well, I guess that depends on a country, but at least where I am for now, which is Sarajevo, not much has changed, except that we are way behind the rest of the world when it comes to vaccination. Anyway, welcome to another episode. For those who are first time with us, this is part of a Seven Insider project that started with the outbreak of the pandemic. And once we all got caught in this situation, we were looking for a way to sort of break through a little bit and mitigate the effects that pandemic has on us when it comes to content and all the noise that we are exposed to on internet. And as a result, we created Seven Insider, which is at this moment free platform that spans across the whole Seven ecosystem and includes both Seven Agency, Seven Foundation, and Seven Academy. And as you can see, we have very populated calendar. So I urge everyone to sign up. I'm sure there is something for everyone. And as I was instructed before we start with this one, I was asked to share something first. So here it is.
Between photographers and dogs, there's something very special, and they both know it. Yes, there's no other zine in the world like dog food. Dog Food 3 contains lean red meat that will feed your photographer's imagination, with other ingredients including a new photo manifesto, photographer's trigger fingers, collage interviews, a new photo roman, and tasty morsels from our dog food editors. Put your trust in dog food. Available at photo festivals and bookstores around the world for free.
So for those who know dog food zine, it's pretty clear that we are having with us Jason Eskenazi, an American photographer. And I'm very happy that he's here, especially because I read somewhere that he's planning to somewhat retire as photographer. But we'll get to that later. So I'm just going to say a few things before I introduce Jason. Like I said, Jason is an American photographer born in 1960. And among various accolades, grants, and awards he got, I will mention, obviously, Guggenheim Fellowship, Fulbright Scholarship. One of his books that we're going to talk about today won Best Photography Book at Pictures of the Year International Contest. And he also received Dorothea Lange, Paul Taylor Prize, and Alicia Patterson grant. So the reason why we have Jason here is that he just completed his, if I'm not mistaken, 30 years long journey, which was presented in a trilogy, and the most recent one just came out now, recently, and it's called Departure Lounge. So it feels like a perfect timing for this. Now, Jason, as he said himself, and as I know, prefers books as a way of disseminating and showcasing his work. So he's a perfect guest. So I will introduce Jason. And actually, I'd like to start with the question, and we will first show the first part of the trilogy, Wonderland, which is an epic book first published by Demo in the States and later published by Jason's own Red Hook publishing house. And so Jason, I'm going to share a PDF now. And with that, I'd like to ask you, why do we make books? Why
Good question.
why in this, and let me just to start sharing, why in this digital age where everything is, well, either for free, which is not necessarily a problem, but definitely in a digital age where we are, the tactile element is now reserved for our touch screens. Why do we bother with this complicated, expensive, and difficult to distribute? I mean, there's so many cons, inverted commas, to make books today, and especially photographic books, because they're so expensive to produce, takes forever to make them, and so on. So why do you make books?
Well, good question. I mean, strangely enough, I was never a photo book collector when I was, in my 20s or 30s. I got books. I enjoyed books. I went to Barnes and Noble on Union Square and sat on the carpet and looked at books, and at Strand, of course. And back years ago, there was a photographer's place, but I never collected books as a collector. And so my love for books comes from making them, I think. I mean, I very much enjoy making them. And you ask why make books in this day and age? Well, if you don't have electricity and you don't have cords and USB things and screens and ways to look at it, the book still exists. And I remember there was a Twilight Zone episode where Burgess Meredith, wanted to read, and there was a nuclear explosion, and he got his chance to read the book. So the book survived, and so somehow books survive. And my brothers were in book publishing business as well, and so I kind of got that from the family. And so for me, a book is something you can take anywhere, read it on the F train, keep it on the shelf, look at it, and it's a tactile experience. So for me, the book is a tactile experience of an author, even a dead author, speaking to someone who's actually looking at the book in the present. So for me, there's a magic there. And for me, the magic is in the actual book.
So I already started browsing through the first book, Wonderland. So that's basically also this book and the stuff, the photographs in this book, they coincide basically with your career, if I'm not mistaken. Your career, which started with Eastern Europe, Eastern Bloc, and then fairly quickly moved to Russia or Soviet Union, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was already 30 years old and wanting to be a photographer, but really had no idea how does one go about being a photographer. There was ICP uptown at 94th or 93rd Street and Fifth Avenue. And, but otherwise, there were no things like this, webinars and, photo schools I really didn't know about too much. So I had a few photo friends and I assisted some photographers back in the 1980s, worked for a local Queens newspaper. But, I think I was drawn to, sort of the last straw was that the Berlin Wall was falling down in 1989. And I was living in Brooklyn in a loft, and this sort of got me going to thinking how to be a photographer. And basically, I learned how to be a photographer is that you buy film, you buy a good pair of shoes, and you buy a plane ticket, and you go someplace, and you sort of leave it open to what's happening. So for the first German elections, or East German elections they were, I guess, in 1990, I think it was April, I went to Berlin for a month or two, and then I went to Bucharest, Romania, the same year, and went back home. And then finally, in June of 1991, I went to what was then still the Soviet Union, which lasted for another 3 months until the coup in August of 1991. So yes, I would say my career basically begins with going to Berlin, Bucharest, and Russia in 1990, 1991.
So one thing other than obviously striking imagery is, and that goes for all of your books, The pictures are standalone on the page. There are no captions, and I'm just curious, why is that? Especially because in this particular book, you cover what's today 20 different countries, plus minus, right? So even though
In
for
the
me,
in the trilogy, yeah.
so for me, it's not
Sorry.
difficult
Yeah,
to.
in the
Sorry.
trilogy, there's Go ahead. Sorry.
So for me, it's absolutely not a problem to follow this beautiful, flawless flow of images and to sort of get to my own conclusion. But I'm just curious about that because obviously this is very much, all the images are done in a very in a documentary style, and but yet they are combined to somehow create, in a way, different meaning. So they're slightly going, how would I say, they transcend, I guess that's the right word, what these individual are, which are, individual images are as documentary as they get, informative. They treat at the time very much, in some cases, newsworthy events. But yet here, when you combine them the way you combine, they are meaning, they're creating a new meaning. So I'm just curious, where is the place of text and in particular captions in your books? I mean, I know it's at the end, but I'm just curious why you decided
Right.
to leave them
Yeah.
as they are.
Yeah, in this trilogy, especially Wonderland, which is much older, of course, published in 2007, I believe, but that was work from the 1990s. So it was published, 7, 8 years after I finished shooting. And yes, I went to Russia in the kind of Robert Capa, vest, photo vest, and the Leica here and the other cameras, thinking in a more photojournalistic style. And what drew me to these locations, of course, is the historical events, the current events that were happening, and I was very much taken by these things. But when I really got into starting to take pictures, I did work for the New York Times and other things, shooting color slides and shooting black and white on my own with my M6. And then I just naturally was more interested in sort of just pursuing my black and white work, and did that. So in some ways, I look at this work as very conceptual, even though it's very documentary, and shot in a very documentary way. There's nothing really manipulated in the photos, and they're all kind of 5 meters or 5 feet away. It's all very similar as a sort of observer. I really like the notion of being an observer and finding things and coming upon happenstance and serendipity of things and learning my trade as I was. I wouldn't say I was a great photographer when I got there, but I wouldn't say I'm a great photographer now, but I was less of a photographer back then, certainly, learning about composition and foreground and background and things like that. So I was really very new to shooting. And so I see the books combined being very conceptual. You mentioned about the captions and the text. And yes, I specifically put the captions at the back and a personal text at the back of the books. All 3 books are kind of very similar in that way, without captions. And I did that because I studied American literature, English literature, 19th century psychology as well at Queens College. And what I took from there, lessons of don't tell me, show me. So even in writing short stories back then, or writing poems, taking these classes, it was always about showing, not telling explicitly. So for me, this notion, this very Umberto Eco notion of like, don't tell everything, and leave it to the viewer's imagination, to create their own stories. So for me, the story was a very important thing. How to create a story through a sequence of imagery. And really, I learned that through the years and years of working on this. I didn't go to Russia specifically to work on a book called Wonderland. Certainly that came much later as I was thinking about what to do with the photos, how to couch them into what format. I didn't really know anything about bookmaking or anything like that. So it was a learning process all along the way of learning how to shoot and learning how to edit and sequence and what format to put them in. For me, the book is couched in a sort of fairy tale format. And if we went back and looked at some of the images, I can tell you how these images directly relate to the sort of theory of fairy tales and the structure behind the fairy tales. So the word structure, again, is a super important term. It's sort of like if you're making a building, what structure is underlying the building to put all the concrete on or the wood? You have to have a structure behind it. Then you eliminate the structure by putting the facade on. So there's a structure in the book, but also there's a facade. So the whole thing then becomes the facade of showing things. It's like Eric Clapton, they called him slow hand, he did incredible guitar work, but he didn't show it, It looks so effortless and easy. So in some ways, I'm taking so many cues from music, from cinema, from literature, all in the back of my head when I'm creating and making something.
I just moved back to the beginning of the book. You dedicated this picture to Yevgeny Kaldei. So, or Haldei, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. For those who don't know, he was a Soviet photographer of Jewish origins who worked for Red Army. And, well, his most famous picture is the Reichstag picture. And so I'm just curious, why did you dedicate it to him? I saw his show, by the way, I saw his show just after he died. There was his big exhibition in Amsterdam. Anyway, so how come you dedicated to, I mean, I can understand why, but I just wanted to hear it from you.
Back, in the 90s or so, I had a photographer, German friend named Reinhard Krum, and he worked for TASS agency as a writer and photographer, I remember. And we traveled together in the early 90s in the Caucasus and Central Asia. And, one day or one night, I remember being in the back of the bus in some suburb of Moscow, and there was someone reading a newspaper in front of me, and it had a picture of Yevgeny Kaldei holding his famous Berlin Reichstag photo. And, I looked over the person's shoulder and I mentioned that, oh, that guy is still alive. He was shooting in the 40s. And so some days later or weeks, I can't remember, my friend Reinhard said, I have to go visit this famous photographer. You want to come along? And it happened to be Yevgeny Kaldei, who was also living, on the kind of outskirts of Moscow. And we became friends. And I went to visit him from time to time. I would bring my friends there and became very close with the family. And he was the quintessential photographer. He had his darkroom in his bedroom, and a big portrait on the wall of his wife who looked like Ingrid Bergman. And, I knew him until he died. And then I helped the family organize their archive afterwards. So for me, that's why. That's why it's dedicated to him.
And so the subtitle of the book is A Fairy Tale of the Soviet Monolith. And you mentioned it earlier as that every fairy tale has a structure, and it usually involves a hero or heroine performing difficult tasks to eventually being rewarded for it. So I'm just curious, why fairy tale? And on top of everything, obviously, Wonderland is something borrowed from literature, a very known how would you say, term from Alice in Wonderland. So I'm just curious how, obviously using very specific title and a subtitle, fairy tale, works with, where's the intersection between these two things, the title, subtitle, and very documentary nature of your works? I'm just curious, how does that, how did you come to that and why?
Right. Going a little backwards, the nature of the documentary work is basically, I didn't want my hand on things. I was a bit of a hands-off photographer. Instead of, doing things with heavy blacks and this thing, I wanted to kind of recreate sort of 50s style photography. So in some ways, they're not very contrasty. they're kind of like a bit of this nostalgia for the 1950s and this maybe world of Stalin or something like that. And so I just gravitated towards this kind of printing. And the term Wonderland, of course, comes from Alice in Wonderland. And as I was thinking about how to organize the photos, I just thought, what's important to the Russians? Like and I used to go to these old markets and find all these books about fairy tales and Russian fairy tales. And of course, the Germans had fairy tales as well. And the Germans and the Russians kind of coincided with, in the 1920s and 30s of making the photo magazines. So there was a big connection there. And so I thought how to tell this, how to organize my photos. And I started to read some structural thesis about fairy tales, especially Bruno Bettelheim. I don't know if I read him after or I read him before or during, but somehow I started with the first photo as the protagonist, as would be in a fairy tale, and then kept going and building upon the structure. So for me, the very simple structure of a fairy tale, it's about a young woman and a parent figure dies, a grandmother or mother, and the girl is forced out into the world, generally into a forest, into nature, where she learns the lessons of life, or the big bad wolf and things like that. And fairy tales are basic stories of maturation, of growing up. That's why they're good for children. They sort of they tell the harsh realities of life, but in a very soft way with animals and things like that. So for me, the Soviet Union falling apart was sort of like the parent figure that left, and then the Russians were sort of out to fend on their own in the real world. So for me, there was a very tenuous connection, but that was enough for me to make it. And I'm not saying to the reader, you have to look at it in fairy tale format, but this was sort of the structure I had in my head as I was creating it.
So now that we went through Wonderland and it's a part of trilogy, so when you set off to make Wonderland, or when you arrived to Soviet Union, did you had in mind the trilogy, or that was sort of work in progress or something that what was
Right.
the train process?
Well, when you mention that these are, these three books are, a 30-year project, it's not really a 30-year project. I didn't set out to do it, but it took 30 years to finish, so certainly when I went to Russia, I had nothing in my head about bookmaking or anything like that. It was kind of to be a photojournalist and to go to these events. So it was only years later, while I was still in Russia, but in the late 90s, say that I was thinking about how to put these things together, and sort of Wonderland came out of that very naturally in some ways. I remember looking at books, at Barnes and Noble or Strand, and especially books of Larry Towell and Antonin Kurtachvil, who had the books in cardboard. I remember there was so like this kind of cover and this aesthetic I liked very much, and I sort of lifted that kind of thing. And also, I wanted things to be kind of a tabula rasa, it's like a book, and there was no photo on the book, and that also comes back to the novel and literature, and things like that. I did not want to make a photo book in some ways. I wanted to make a literature book with photos, with images. So in that way, and the same reason is why there are no captions under the photos, because I want the viewer to look at the photo clean, to make associations, and to go through the book and create their own story, basically. As a photographer or bookmaker, you're basically in a collaboration. You're in a collaboration first with the people you shoot, on the street or whatever. And if you think you're invisible, maybe someone didn't see you, but most times people do see you, and they sort of, they don't bother you and they let you shoot. So there's a sort of silent collaboration there. And then there's also another collaboration as the bookmaker with, you're not sitting generally with the person viewing the book and explaining it to them. The person who bought the book is looking at the book alone, maybe, at a fireplace on a nice comfortable chair or something like that. So then there's a collaboration with you and the viewer. So you're talking to them. So in that way, I felt that the book is sort of the perfect vehicle for that. I think I missed a bit of the last part of your question. I forgot, but
No, you didn't. I didn't want to break the flow. So
mhm.
here we are at your second part of the trilogy, and Black Garden. So I'm just curious, and which was published by your own publishing house, Red Hook Book Editions. So I'm just going to
Yes.
start going through them, and
Mhm.
actually I'm going to share it like this because I think it
Mhm.
shows nicer when we have those spreads. Is that okay with you?
Yep. Mhm.
So this is obviously, it covers a very different part of the world, which is the world as ancient Greeks knew about it, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm just going to ask you straight away why there are in this book there are also pictures from the U.S. So I'm just
Right.
curious, how
Mhm.
does that work? Obviously, you're American, so I can understand your personal position, but I'm just curious, how does it how does it add up to this idea of doing a book about the world that ancient Greeks knew?
Right. Well, starting with Black Garden, that title comes from Karabakh, Nagorno-Karabakh. I was there in the 90s, and I always remembered that name. And I usually keep a store of titles in my head or written on paper of maybe for projects in the future. So that title always kind of stuck with me. But it had other titles before, like uh, the Hubris of Empire or Atlantis, that was kind of playing, and basically bookmaking is a sort of play. You come up with an idea and you sort of develop it, and then you shoot and develop it more. So it's not like everything is shot, then you have the idea. It's a kind of ongoing process, and important to be very open to things. So back after I left Russia in 2000, 2001, say, the World Trade Center bombing, destruction already happened. And I came back to New York in, late 2001, and had the idea to do a second book, where Wonderland was, kind of loosely based on a fairy tale. I was thinking more about uh, the Greeks and mythologies. And I was always interested in mythology. I never studied it, but it was always interesting for me about the hero journey. And I remember also the popular series by Joseph Campbell about mythology on Channel 13, PBS, and that really was super important for me. And so for me, I see the photographer sometimes on a hero journey. The photographer goes out into the world and comes back with images and takes a lot of risks and comes back with the stories in some way. So I sort of thought of that as well. And so the book starts, basically after 2001, or the remnants of downtown New York for me. It's kind of starts there, the journey. And I was always very impressed. You hear sort of tidbits from people and about how other photographers worked. I remember hearing about Gilles Perez, that, he went to Iran or wherever he went to shoot in the Balkans as well, or in Africa. And he would start shooting the second he got, into the car to go to the airport. So the journey starts, in Brooklyn or Queens. So for me, the journey also kind of starts in New York, and sort of building some images. And I went to Istanbul because I have some ancestry, from Istanbul, Sephardic Jewish, and my grandparents are from Salonika, and also some from Çanakkale in Turkey. And so there was always a draw to be back in that, let's say, old world, and so I relocated in Istanbul in much later, of course, in 2009. There was an 8-year gap between, finishing Wonderland, but Wonderland got published in 2007. So working on Wonderland, and those days I was very poor, and I took a job at the Met Museum as a security guard for 1 year. But at the end of that, then I sort of got back out on the road, influenced again by the Robert Frank American show, which I was guarding there. So there's long gaps, so when you say 30 years, certainly there was an 8-year gap where I wasn't working on any of this, and I was shooting in New York, I guess parades and things like that, but I certainly was not on the road for 30 years shooting this. It was a developing thing. And Black Garden came. And then at some point I thought, oh, I might as well do a trilogy, trilogies, and working at the Met, which we'll see later, guarding famous paintings and triptychs and things like that. So informing me along the way. So everything sort of kept growing little by little. There was no big overall plan. Each book kind of grew. And then at the end of that trilogy or cycle, I thought about how to connect the books together. And again, influenced by cinema and other things, I was very influenced by say Kieslowski, and the trilogy, the red, white, and blue, was very influential about finding structures, and then so in that way, I'm just borrowing many things and sort of trying to come up with something that's personal to me.
So chapters in your books are basically, they're spanning from the numbers, the numeration of the chapters, they go from one book to another, right? So you must, was that an attempt to sort of create one body of work, or I'm just trying to figure, I mean, that's what it tells me. So that's one thing, if you can clarify a little bit of that numeration of the chapters. And there's a very distinctive, I would say, I wouldn't say change in style, but here in Black Garden, you started using different formats. I'm just curious about that. I mean, camera formats, film formats. And also in the first book, pictures have no borders. There's only white of the paper. But here, each image is basically surrounded by the edges of the negative. So I'm just curious, what's that about?
Right. So the sequential chapters 1, 2, 3 in Wonderland, 4, 5, 6 in Black Garden, and 7, 8, 9 in Departure Lounge, of course, has been done specifically to tie the books into one unit, and also the numbers of the plates are also sequential. So where Wonderland starts at 1 to 77, Black Garden picks up at 78 to something, 200 something, and then Departure Lounge picks up where Black Garden left off and goes to number 314. So look, I'm playing with a bit numerology and a little this and a little that, to sort of find some cohesiveness between the three things. And so then the chapter numbers and the plate numbers sort of bring that into one big piece of work. And each work sort of references the other, which we'll see later on when we see all three books. I matched some of the photos for a specific reason, which we can talk about that. In Wonderland, I basically use a 35 millimeter lens for everything. I thought in Black Garden to change it up a bit, and a lot of it is 28 millimeter. And also I decided to introduce a panoramic photo, a panoramic camera, the Hasselblad X-Pan, to shoot with that as well. So I wanted to accentuate sort of the photos. I mean, the way the books are laid out, it's a very monotonous thing. It's like a flip book or cinema. There are no verticals in any of the books. So, and there's no page layouts with a smaller photo here, a bigger photo there. So in some ways, I wanted people just to flip through the books and not be so bothered by one photo is bigger than the other, one photo is color, one is black and white. So I wanted to slowly introduce and expand the vision sort of, and sort of the X-Pan expands that vision. And there are 9 X-Pan photos in the book, just like there are 9 chapters in all 3 books. So I'm just playing with numbers. 9 is an important number, 9 muses, 9 this, 9 that. And 314 is also a significant number. If you put a point in between 3.14, that's pi. Not that these things are so important, but I wanted to, develop some intrigue, like secret things, like the name of the rose, or, like these things where there's secrets and doors where you can go in and go into. So for me, the book and the project is stepping into something deeper. It's like when you watch a film, you're introduced to the characters, then the plot slowly develops and thickens, and you get further and further into it. And for me, the photo book is not a photo book. The photo book is a vehicle, or it's a novel, or it's a movie, or something like that. Even though, say, Cartier-Bresson, the master photographer, every single image is a masterpiece. He didn't, maybe this is sacrilege, but he didn't actually make photo books. His books are collections of images, maybe about France or the decisive moment, or about this or about that. Amazingly wonderful, wonderful books. The books he made about Moscow, wow, so amazing. But, the conceptual book, you think about where did that start, and maybe William Klein, or maybe Kudelka, Gilles Perez, and things like that. So for me, I was more interested in the book as the object. So for me, making the trilogy was making, 3 objects that sort of fit together perfectly. And actually, the size of the books, Wonderland and Departure Lounge, fit exactly into the format of Black Garden.
And also Black Garden, sorry, this is a little bit off topic, but Black Garden was published and funded. The book is actually was funded through crowdsourcing, right?
Yes, back, I think, when I was still working at the Met, I did some crowdfunding for Black Garden, and that process took a very, very long time, and the people got their perks years and years later. So yeah, and even back then, I did not have the notion of a trilogy. So, I was living in Red Hook, and sort of getting ready to, thinking about Black Garden for years, and then finally getting on the road after quitting the Met, the museum, and then starting Black Garden in very late 2009, 2010. I went to Egypt, I went to Istanbul, and I made several trips. I would, go back to New York. I wouldn't develop any film in there. I would mostly bring it all, and that's the way I did mostly everything. I mean, I would just accumulate hundreds of rolls of film and bring it back to Queens and start developing myself. So I never really saw the results till months and months later, sometimes a year later, which is kind of detrimental to the learning process, but kind of that's what I did. I was a little afraid to look at everything, and but yeah, so that's kind of how that happened.
So
yeah, and crowdfunding. Yes, I did crowdfunding for Black Garden.
So I just actually, while I was preparing for this, I read that with the Departure Lounge, which I'm sharing right now, you're looking into quitting it as a photographer, or ending your career, or retiring, or however you want to call it. So I'm just curious, is that still happening, or not? And just before you answer, I just want to say to everyone, feel free to ask questions. I already posted in our chat, but feel free to ask any questions in the Q&A box, and we'll have Jason reply. So yes, so what's with all that? I mean, you're still obviously very strong and energetic, and why would you?
Right. Well, you have Departure Lounge on the screen, so I'll just add that Departure Lounge came from a small room, the title that we had while I was living in Red Hook. We called the Departure Lounge. So that stayed in my head as well. And then Departure Lounge took on other meanings about, metaphorical meanings for me, about departing from reality, and departing from how we depart from reality, maybe through drugs, through this, through that. And the ultimate depart from reality is when you die. So, so that's kind of the metaphorical stuff I was thinking about then for that, which is basically not any new photos, but photos taken, some of them taken back in Russia and the former Soviet Union, and some of them Turkey and that region as well. So I kind of used archival photos mostly. You know, I wasn't out shooting a new project called Departure Lounge. But somehow, you know, that idea, the notion of making a third book sort of gave me the opportunity to tie the books together. Instead of two books, now I had the way to come back to the beginning of the books. And you can see in the first photo in Wonderland and the last photo in Departure Lounge, there's the same figure. And we can get into that a bit after when we show the kind of double photos. And remind me again,
Are you leaving
the
us?
basic question.
Are you
Oh,
leaving us?
okay. You know, yes, no, yes, no. The point of that, besides being a little overly dramatic, was that, you know, even though I'm a documentary photographer, I'm not a documentary photographer. I feel like I'm a conceptual photographer in some ways, but not a kind of outwardly conceptual. The books make the work conceptual. So the photos are couched within a conceptual concept. CCC, couched in a conceptual concept. So I almost was pretending to be a documentary photographer. And in that way, my interest now after these three books is not to shoot in such a straightforward manner anymore. Is to develop other kinds of ways to tell stories or things like that. So so in that way, I quit that type of photography as the documentary photographer, Jason Eskenazi, and we'll see what comes, some other books and some other things. But that sort of life I wanted to sort of put behind me so I can develop in other ways. So it's important for me not to be so static, but to develop in some ways. Like you can say Robert Frank developed, you know, immediately. He never went back to do another book like The Americans. Well, before The Americans was ever published, he was already shooting film, you know, working on those documentaries and eventually the Rolling Stones documentary and other things, and then came back to photography. You know, my dates are not exact, but, you know, in the early 70s with Lines of My Hand. But that was a completely different animal in some ways. So a way to look at things, a much more personal way to look at things. And, you know, he had gone through, you know, so he's adding, you know, personal elements, and the books consistently got more personal through the death of his son and his daughter. And whenever I went to visit Robert Frank, I mean, was a lovely guy, you know, but you can see the sadness in his face, you know. And in that way, I wanted to leave a certain kind of genre behind and then be free to do anything I wanted to do.
Okay, well, I'm glad you're not leaving us. So now that we went through the trilogy, basically, there is some stuff that we should address, and I think there are not that many amazing photographers who are also publishers, magazine editors, book editors, and so on and so forth. So you're sort of a Renaissance man, and it's a whole package. So I'm just curious a little bit about the whole process, because obviously it's using your books as a case study. So here you are, you're an author, a photographer. You raise funds in whatever way you find it possible. Then you go out, produce the work. You also edit. That's one of the questions here by Joanna, who's asked. So I'm just going to ask her a question, but it's basically exactly the same thing I want to ask. So do you always work alone on sequencing, or you turn to an editor at some point, and then eventually you raise funds to produce books, and then you publish the book? So it's a whole package deal. So yes, as Joanna said. So how do you how I would expand her question? How do you make all that happen? It's at least 5 people, 5-person job, right? So I'm just curious, how does that all, how do you make it happen?
Well, if you wanted to put on some of those other slides that we have, like of the metal board or the triptych.
Yes, well, you wanted me to share the triptych, so I'm sharing it here.
Right.
This one. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll just mention this and then cover the questions, is that, being influenced by everything around you, everything that you've ever read, everything that you ever listened to, there are structures. Movies have structures, paintings have structures, books have structures. When I was working at the Met, I saw this structure, and in European art on the second floor, and it took me, because these things were meant to be closed as well and opened up, and so I fashioned the three books just like that they fit exactly into the central piece. So Black Garden is somehow the central piece, where Wonderland is on the left and Departure Lounge is on the right. So for me, there's no one way to go about doing things about editing and sequencing, but I'm very involved in that, certainly. So I live with the photos, and you can show the metal board if that's kind of the next one, or one. Yeah. For me, it's very important to print out the photos, 5 by 7 inches with a white border, and put them on the wall, put them on the floor. I learned early on that a metal board is your best friend with magnets, and you just put the photos there. And when you wake up in the morning, you have your coffee, you look at it, you start to make a sequence. And where do you begin? You begin at the beginning, and then you end at the ending. So for me, it's about a puzzle. It's like a puzzle building things, where you just choose your first photo. Where do you want to start this story? And the story, what is the story? Is the story, if you're making these kinds of books, which is not specifically about a specific people or place, but kind of more personal, you start to tell yourself a story, and that's where it begins. You tell yourself a story, and that's the structure you impose onto your photos. But when you finish that story, you take that structure off, you take the form off, and you don't tell anyone your story anymore. And then that leaves room for the viewer to create their own story, which is very important. When we talk about sequencing and editing, for me, I always say the space between the photos is just as important as the photos themselves, meaning that when you go from photo 1 to photo 2, there's a gap. You turn a page, and there's a kind of silence, like a silence between notes. Say if you're writing a symphony or something like that, you have quarter notes and half notes, but there's a gap, there's a silence, and that silence and that gap is the place where the viewer comes in to create their own stories. So how you connect those things, and that's a very personal thing, and that's about everything you ever read again and listened to and saw, is how do you put one photo next to another photo? And this is trial and error, and this is years living with your sequence for years. After you stop shooting, basically the book is not done. Then comes the work of sequencing and editing. I think Robert Frank took at least 1 year to sequence and edit the Americans. So for me, there's that internal process where you do it on your own, but then you have some colleagues and friends whom you would show it to as well. I remember being in Red Hook, and we would put down all the photos on the wooden floor, and then friends would help and say this, and that. So you get lots of opinions, which can drive you crazy, but in the end, you'll take what you want, and you will say that's important, that's not important. So I would take some ideas, and then I remember going upstate in the first edition of Wonderland, sitting with the designer publisher Giorgio with Demo Books, and we put the photos on the wall as well. And he would also help out, and then he has also the perspective of being a designer. He would say, well, you need this many pages in the book, so you have to cut it down or cut this down. So things like that happen. But all in all, the editing and sequencing is something I do on my own, and once in a while I invite a friend or two to look at it, because you want to know how to communicate with the viewer. You don't want to be stuck in your own head all the time. You want to communicate the viewing experience. And so for those reasons, it's a long, but I would say very enjoyable process.
Brilliant. Can you explain what this is that we're looking at now?
This is the central piece of Black Garden. Again, I wanted to expand, put in some new elements each time. Wonderland is one way. Black Garden has the panoramic, and the panoramic for me. And you mentioned why did I shoot in New York for something that takes place in the other side of the world? Is that there was a connection. For me, there was historical connection with family. My family came from this region and crossed the Atlantic to come to New York in the 1920s, and about that time, during World War I, a little before, some a little after. And so there was a kind of line connection between these places. And for me, this connecting of these photos sort of bridges that gap for me as the central piece, right in the center of all the books together. So I experimented with different ways to sort of keep the horizon line, on one horizon with different photos. It was very difficult to find this, and this is a fold out. We say gatefold. It's actually probably a double gatefold inside the book, inside Black Garden.
Sorry.
And one more about the trilogy, you had mentioned this as well at the very beginning, is that the borders on the three books are kind of different. And I also was looking at the notion of thesis, antithesis, or antithesis, and then putting the things together, synthesis. So again, and this is a good slide for this as well, is that you're looking for a way to drive people through the books. And it's an experience. You watch a movie or you read a novel, and you as the author, not even saying as the photographer, I'm saying as the author, you are obligated to make it interesting enough that somebody wants to keep turning the pages. So for me, I structured in the new edition of Wonderland, that there would be bigger white borders, and then Departure Lounge has black borders, and the pictures are exactly the same size, but there's a kind of thesis antithesis going on there. And then Black Garden seems to be somewhere in the middle, is that I was using the messy black borders from my enlarger as well. So that has another different effect, and that's kind of a bit retro to the 1980s or, things like 1990s. But, I felt like I wanted to distinguish, the three books in that way. So another fact was that the original printing of Wonderland cropped some of the photos. So I'm not sure I was aware of that at the beginning, or I was too naive, or didn't question the publisher, about cropping photos to fit in that format. So the new Wonderland brings back the original, the full frame to the images. So all the pictures are full frame.
Got it.
And not because I'm a purist, I'm just, it would be more that I'm lazy. You can endlessly crop photos. So I didn't want that task. I know, like in the Americans, Robert Frank cropped a lot of photos in certain ways and even took some verticals out of horizontals. But I didn't want to do that. I wanted to kind of keep it clean. And this graph that you're showing, I think, was given to me. I remember Don Weber using that in Canada, and I said, give me that, please. And so this is a basic plot points in fiction or any kind of dramatic arc about how you introduce characters and plot points, and the action is rising until you come to a crisis point, basically somewhere not in the middle, but near the middle of the book, and then you have climax and resolution. So for me, again, I was kind of following this a bit and structuring the editing where you would build to one photo. And for me, Wonderland does have one photo, which is a kind of dramatic climax, and then it kind of comes off and it drifts here and there to come to some resolution. But again, that was in the 3 chapters in Wonderland. But then I expanded that to more of into the 3 books. So Wonderland is sort of the thesis. Black Garden is sort of the antithesis, and then Departure Lounge is sort of the synthesis to come to some resolve. So you want a viewing experience. At the end of a movie, you want to feel like you've been on a roller coaster, but then you're finally safe and you relax and you feel like you went through some experience. So I feel like I want to give the viewer some experience and to go as deep as they want to go.
And you prepared a few images of the books and how they work.
Right.
So just to explain to people, so here we have on left is Departure Lounge, and on the right is the Black Garden, correct?
Right.
So
I came up with the idea of, that somehow this 30 years, existed in a moment, in a kind of dreamlike moment. And if you actually added up all the, the exposure times of 1/500th of a second or whatever, these 30 years basically existed in, 3.5 seconds, something like that, So for me, I wanted to sort of, bring, play with the notion of time. And time is really the thing that gives us the pathos of life, or the ethos, knowing that there's not so much time to do something, or that so much time has passed, wow, that happened 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And so this notion, I wanted to bring to the books, and somehow it popped into my head because I was looking at my contact sheets. And to get back to why you need to print your photos and why I still shoot analog is that I get to see these contact sheets not on a screen, but in a box, and I play with them, and I can see the relationship between the photos, that this photo was taken before this one, or this photo was taken after that one. So I decided to put some kind of connections between the photos that existed on the same contact sheet. So here, for instance, this one in Wonderland, which is on the right, that was taken in Baku, in, I don't know, 1997 or something like that. But I remember there was another photo from Baku on the same contact sheet. So that's the way I connected Wonderland to Departure Lounge. And then I'm taking a step back. So I'm including another figure in this. So I'm playing with a bit of space and time. So even though these photos are in separate books, they're then connected by this kind of repetition. It's not that I didn't feel like I had enough good photos. I wanted to specifically and purposely do this to connect. And here we have on the left, again, Departure Lounge, and on the right, we have Wonderland. Again, it's connecting the same moment in the same place of Sergei and Natasha, in Ukraine, in Lvov, when I shot that. Here we have called The Last Call, the last day of school. And again, Wonderland is on the right, Departure Lounge is on the left, and this is exactly at the same time. And here again, we have, yeah, you can go to the next one, it's fine. Yeah, so here we have a wedding in, Central Russia. And so I again pulled back from that scene to show the hand playing, or the next moment at the wedding. So, I don't remember, it's not exactly the next frame, maybe it's the second frame after that, but I'm showing somehow a story or a flip book, and sort of connecting the things and creating a backstory, there's something else going on. So for me, this was an important sort of revelation, to happen upon doing something like this. I maybe I've seen it somewhere, but I don't remember seeing anything like this. So for me, again, how to connect the books, how to conceptualize all the books. And basically, again, they're documentary photos, but couched in a concept for me. And that was very important to kind of play with these things, to give things more depth and more things to think about.
So we have a ton of questions, but before we get to that, we also have another video, but we're going to keep that for the very end, as you said. So so where can people get these books, by the way?
You can go to reddickeditions.com, or you can go to jasoneskenazi.com.
So they can get it. They're still
Yeah,
available. Brilliant.
and they're available in bookstores around the world. They're available from Photo Eye, and in Europe, in England and Italy and Germany. So they are definitely available in Australia, in Japan. So I also deal, with bookstores a lot as a publisher. I'm
Who are you?
selling, half the run to bookstores. I like the localness of that, the outreach, that the bookstore has their own clientele, and it's a kind of friendly thing. You go to your local bookstore, they recommend books. So I promote bookstores. I want them to sell my book, and then I just sell them myself on the web, on the internet sites.
So let's try to answer some questions. Hold on. Let me just see what can we start with. So here's one which is not specifically on books, but on photography. And it's a question from Marianne Sievers, if I pronounce it well. And she's asking, how do you justify for yourself photographing humans who might not even know about being photographed in any situation? And are there any situation or context that you would never take a photo of?
I mean, specifically, where you can't take pictures, there are rules and laws about where you can't. Do people? Yes. I mean, you're not supposed to be taking pictures on the subway because people are trapped and they can't escape. It's legal to take pictures on the street because people can just walk away from you. I think I remember Cartier-Bresson saying, not to me, of course, but, that you have to bring a lawyer with you in France if you want to take pictures, because the laws are different there about taking pictures of people on the street. I don't know if that's changed or anything, but, there's a certain sensitivity to shooting people. And if you're a street photographer, you're shooting people. And so there's a kind of balance and method to shooting. If you're that type of photographer. Generally, when I was shooting, I would go to events, so it would be natural for photographers to be there. We were not hiding or anything like that. But if you're the lone street photographer in Manhattan, like David Godless, Richard Sandler, and before them, Gary Winogrand, then there's a certain kind of in and out, ways to not be seen. But of course, you are seen. But I think there's ways to disarm people. I remember walking with Bruce Gilden once on Broadway, and of course, he shot amazingly close to people with a flash. And he would just go up to the guy or something. Oh, my father had a tie like that. So it was a way to kind of disarm. People are very suspicious generally. In certain countries, sometimes in New York, but if you're going to places like Egypt, or people are very suspicious because they see the tool as the camera as a tool of spying on people. So I would say for the photographer, each photographer has his own way to kind of get around that thing. My distance, I was always I'm a 5-foot photographer, 5 meters, 5 feet, always middle ground, 35 millimeter. So I was photographing, scenes. And yes, once in a while, stuff would happen. You get caught as a photographer. Once I was in Gorky Park, and on a day when the soldiers came out to celebrate and get a bit drunk, and I got punched out by a giant of a soldier, and then other times you're arrested. I was definitely taken into custody a few times, in Moscow for shooting things like a movie poster, and staying there too long and police coming, or taking a picture, one picture in departure lounge of a woman in a kind of booth in the subway, where I was just there taking pictures. And I had a press card actually, but after 10 minutes, the woman called on her phone that she has there. And then these two police officers came, rolling down the escalator and caught me and took me by, the back and, interrogated me. these are just sort of what happens, so. And the last question of that, is there something I wouldn't take a photo of? I would say no. I mean, everything can be photographed in some ways, though it depends again on your sensitivity of things. And, I remember being on Lesbos some years ago and just arrived, and there was, refugees coming off, and we would wait till the boats came. And one time someone announced that some guy washed up on the shore, dead. And then all the photographers ran to that, and video cameras and stuff like that. And that was, I didn't photograph that. And I maybe regret it or not, but I don't know. I just felt like I didn't want to do that. But again, some days later, I acclimated to the situation there, and I did photograph a guy who washed up on the shore. So again, I would say, as long as you're a sensitive photographer, you can go pretty deep, and it depends on how you negotiate those things, and if someone tells you, not to photograph them, I would say I wouldn't photograph them. Some photographers, when someone says, don't take my picture, they keep taking their picture, and I would not do that. I would respect people if they really don't want to be photographed. And then you shy away, from intimacy, or, things that are just too, if there's a funeral or something like that, you don't stick your camera in people's face. You lift it, you put it down, you're there, you're not invisible.
And thank you. So Bogdan is asking, as this was a very long and complex process of creating the trilogy, how did you deal with doubt and uncertainty along the way? And what helped you find focus and vision again and again in this, 30-year process?
Well, let me speak for all photographers around the world. There's doubt every day. And, you doubt yourself, should I go out and take pictures today? Shouldn't I do this? I mean, I think that has not changed. There's no, you don't develop a hubris, of like, I can do anything because I've been a photographer for 30 years, or I published this book and that book. I think every photographer from day one to the day they die has this doubt and sometimes laziness. But, whenever you do go out, you are rewarded, you will find something. So, the situation, the circumstance, the work, the walking gives you something at the end of the day, whether it's one photo or many, as long as you go out, you get something. A friend of mine, Ruben Radding, many of you know him, photographed from the beginning of the pandemic, and I guess in his frustration decided, just to go out and shoot. That's how he dealt with things. And I think he shot for 1 year solid and maybe took 5 days off, but continually shoots and shoots and shoots and shoots. And, the record stands for itself, and things like that. And Peter Turnley as well decided to go out and shoot. And so, many photographers like that. So, there is always doubt, and you're faced with a kind of tabula rasa or a blank canvas or a white page, and you just have to start somewhere. So there's always doubt. The trilogy, though, there was not, the trilogy developed, year by year. So there was not like in 1990, in 30 years, I have to produce this trilogy. These things just came step by step, and I kept the door open to other possibilities. So I didn't feel the tension of things. It was a very pleasurable experience, actually, absorbing ideas. For me, I could sit in a chair and listen to music and not do anything, because I want to leave room for the ideas to come into my head, instead of speaking all the time, speaking on the cell phone, always on Facebook, on Instagram, and always putting out, my voice or things like that. I would rather sit still and absorb things and let things mature and maturate. And I think that's the goal, is to not do things too fast, not to think you have to publish a book immediately. You do things when you're ready, and you have to accept when things are ready. When the food is ready, when you're ready to eat, instead of eating at specific times every day, you should eat, basically when you're hungry and stop when you're full. So I would say follow a natural calendar, follow your natural rhythms of things. And, that's the only thing you can do.
So there is thanks. Um, so is there so there's a couple of questions that are related to sequencing. So if you could give an advice or a tip or a technique, or which you kind of answered partially on photo sequencing, if just generally, not necessarily for the books, but book sequencing, but just if you could give another more concise advice on photo sequencing in general.
Right. I don't know if this is more concise, but this is another analogy. I would always, as I mentioned, start with the first photo and maybe put the last photo. Like, where do you want to go? What journey do you want to go on? Is that journey sort of like 77 photos or 125 photos? But have a beginning of the story and create a story. A woman wakes up and goes to the shop, or ends with a funeral, or ends here, that would be too obvious, of course. So, have a beginning and have an end. If you're doing something very photojournalistically, you couldn't say there's a real story there. This is more of an approach of the personal narrative, using, instead of using photos of yourself, like in a Francesca Woodman way, or, you're using other people as stand-ins for your story, so it's a very personal thing. And I feel like all those years I've been photographing my life in some ways, but not shooting myself in the mirror, but shooting other people who kind of stand in for life things of birth and death and these kinds of things. So the other visual metaphors I can give you is that a sequence is like a natural rhythm. It's like a heartbeat or a breath. You breathe in and you breathe out. Or you can, if you play the accordion, you push it in and you take it out. So the sequence can be something that seems to be very close, photo to photo, or a gap, talking about the space between the photos. That space can be longer. I have photos, say in Black Garden, where there's circles and circles. Sometimes that's not a good idea to do it. It's too obvious in some ways. There's a danger of the photographer showing how smart he is. Oh, telling the viewer, look, I found these circles in Baghdad, and then I found these circles in Lebanon, and look how I put them together, and I'm so smart. You don't want the viewer to feel like you're so intelligent. You want the viewer to be on the same, feel like the author is talking to them one-on-one, not down like a lecture or something like that. So that would be the accordion in, like this. And maybe there's a space where there's something else connecting the photos, which is a very tenuous line or thread, and maybe the accordion is out. So it's a kind of breathing. So sequencing also has to do with opposites. Maybe one photo you're indoors, the next photo you're outdoors. One photo, next photo you're far away, the other one you're close. One can have a lot of darks and then lights, dark and light. So you're using kind of opposites to keep the viewer keep going. So you want the viewer to keep adding information, and it's a visual pleasure, just like music. You listen to it. I don't know what Beethoven's Fifth Symphony means. I just listen to it and I enjoy it. So in the same way, a book can be just an enjoyable visual experience. What's the meaning behind it? I would feign away from giving things too much meaning, and just present things, tell the story. And another analogy I make is like making a pizza. And you start with a small dough and you expand it a little, and then you start to put a few pepperoni on it, and maybe you expand it more, and the pepperoni can be like the images. So the images, though, are close together. As you expand the pizza dough, the pepperoni gets separated, of course. But if you actually make a pizza, you put the pepperoni on last, of course. But things like this. So think in visual ways, and I would say find a natural rhythm to looking at the photos, and put them on a metal board, and with the advice of Stanley Green, listen to Aaron Copland, or some music like that. Don't listen to Nirvana, I would say, but listen to music, maybe Eric Satie, Chopin, or something that has structure within it, and notes to actually help you take that framework that's in your head and stick it onto the photo somehow. And as Stanley said, blood on the floor, so in the editing process, you're going to get rid of some photos that you love or that you climbed a mountain for and say, well, I climbed the mountain for this. It has to be in the book, but maybe it doesn't belong in the book. You have to make sure the book is cohesive and the photos work for the book. Instead of putting all your greatest photos in a book, make sure that you use the photos that you need. And maybe later on, you can use those photos for something else. They don't disappear. In some ways, I brought back photos that I liked in Departure Lounge. So there was a place for them after. Wonderland, there are other photos I didn't include. I didn't include any verticals. So I would say find a natural rhythm and be prepared to, kill some of your darlings.
And I think we have time for one more question, and which is, I like it. It's a very generic question, but it's, what's one piece of advice you would give to your 30-year-old self?
Go out and shoot more, don't stay home. You'll never get a photo if you stay home.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Jason. And thank you everyone for staying with us, and make sure to check our calendar. And before we leave, there is that video that you wanted me to show. Will you explain what it is before I play it, or you don't want to explain it?
No, I won't explain it.
Okay, so people, I will say goodbye now and play this. And again, thank you very, very much for joining us. Jason, thank you very much for your time, and make sure to check out Dog Food. So here is a farewell video. Let's hold on. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jason. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Stay safe. Bye.